According to tribal law, you must marry me now, rancher, because you saw me like this. The ranch sat at the edge of a wide valley, where the land slowly changed from fenced pasture to open, protected ground. Daniel Carter had lived there for most of his adult life. He was a quiet man known for keeping to himself, waking before sunrise, and working until the sky turned orange in the evening. His days followed a simple pattern: feeding the horses, checking the fences, fixing whatever time and weather had worn down. He didn't complain. Solitude suited him. After years of disappointment and loss, the land felt safer than people. That morning began like any other. The air was cool, carrying the smell of dry grass and earth. Daniel saddled his horse and rode toward the far boundary of his ranch, where a broken fence had been reported by a neighboring land officer. That area bordered tribal land, a place Daniel respected and rarely entered. He had grown up hearing that those lands followed different rules, older rules, shaped by generations of belief and survival. He never questioned them. He simply stayed out of the way. As he rode, clouds gathered unexpectedly, dulling the sun. A light wind picked up, bending the tall grass in waves. Daniel reached the broken fence and dismounted, inspecting the damage. It looked recent, possibly caused by a fallen branch after last night's storm. He worked silently, focused, unaware that he was not alone. A sound reached him. Soft, hurried footsteps, then a sharp intake of breath. Daniel froze. Slowly he turned. A young woman stood a short distance away near the trees, clearly startled. She looked as surprised as he felt. Her clothes were traditional, worn but clean, and she seemed distressed, as if she had been searching for something or trying to avoid being seen. Her face flushed with alarm when their eyes met. For a moment, neither spoke. The wind filled the silence between them. I didn't know anyone was here," Daniel said carefully, raising his hands slightly to show he meant no harm.
The woman took a step back, her expression shifting from surprise to fear.
She looked around, as if hoping someone else might appear. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice tight. "This land, this is not yours." Daniel nodded. "I'm fixing a fence. I didn't mean to cross over. I'll leave." But the woman didn't relax. Instead, her breathing grew shallow and her eyes filled with panic. She wrapped her arms around herself as though the moment itself weighed heavily on her. "It's too late," she whispered. Daniel frowned, confused. Too late for what? She hesitated, clearly struggling to find the words. When she spoke again, her voice trembled, not with anger, but with fear of something much larger than both of them. "You saw me," she said. "You were not meant to." Daniel felt a knot tighten in his chest. He hadn't done anything wrong, not intentionally, but something about her reaction told him that intention didn't matter.
"I didn't mean any disrespect," he said quickly. "I'll go."
"I promise." But she shook her head. "It doesn't work like that," she explained slowly, choosing each word with care. According to her tribe's customs, certain moments were considered sacred and private. Being seen during such a moment by an outsider carried serious meaning. It wasn't about shame. It was about honor, tradition, and responsibility passed down through generations. Daniel listened, stunned. He had lived near this land for years and thought he understood boundaries, but this was something entirely different. "There must be another way," he said. "I didn't even know." Her eyes dropped to the ground. Knowing or not does not change the law. Silence settled between them again, heavier now. Daniel felt the weight of her words pressing on him. This wasn't a misunderstanding that could be laughed off or forgotten. For her, this moment could affect her family, her standing in the tribe, and her future. "My name is Ayana," she finally said, as if giving her name made the situation more real. "And if I return without resolving this, there will be consequences." Daniel introduced himself quietly. He felt awkward saying his name, like it somehow made things worse. He studied her face and saw strength beneath the fear, a strength shaped by responsibility and loyalty. "What happens now?" he asked. Ayana hesitated, then spoke the words that changed everything. "According to tribal law," she said, barely above a whisper, "you must marry me now because you saw me like this." The sentence hung in the air, unreal and heavy. Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it again. His mind raced, searching for logic, for options, for a way out that wouldn't hurt her. That's not possible," he finally said.
"We just met." She nodded sadly. "I know." Rain began to fall, light at first, then steady, as if the sky itself acknowledged the seriousness of the moment.
Daniel felt the cold drops soak through his shirt, grounding him in reality. This wasn't a story or a rumor. This was happening. "I never wanted this," Ayana said softly. "But tradition does not ask what we want." Daniel looked toward the ranch, then back at her, realizing that walking away would not simply end the situation. It would leave her to face judgment alone. "Let's talk," he said at last. "There has to be understanding before decisions." She studied him carefully, as if trying to measure his character in seconds. Finally, she nodded. They stood there as the rain fell harder, two strangers bound by a moment neither had chosen, both aware that life would never feel simple again. And somewhere between the falling rain and the silent land around them, the first thread of an unexpected fate began to weave itself into both their lives. Daniel felt the rain soaking through his coat, the chill crawling into his bones. But he barely noticed it. His mind was entirely focused on Ayana's words. He had grown up respecting boundaries, keeping out of places he wasn't invited. And yet, here he was, caught in a situation he didn't understand. The weight of the tribal law she spoke of pressed heavily on him, as if the very ground beneath them was holding its breath. Ayana looked uneasy, glancing at the tree line as if expecting someone to appear at any moment. Her face was serious, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. Daniel realized that she was not only explaining a law, she was explaining her life, the rules that shaped her, and the consequences she could not ignore. "You need to understand," she said, her voice firm despite the trembling of her hands. "This law isn't just words. It has guided our people for generations. Honor, respect, family, it's all connected. Being seen like this means I cannot simply return home without someone taking responsibility. If I do, I risk shame and my family could face judgment." Daniel swallowed, trying to make sense of it. He had heard about customs in tribal communities before, but he had never imagined a law that could change a person's life in such a sudden, irreversible way. He looked at her closely, noticing the tension in her shoulders, the careful way she spoke, and the unspoken courage she carried. "Responsibility?" he asked, his voice barely above the rain. "You mean me?" Ayana nodded. "Yes, you are the one who saw me. The law does not ask if you are ready. It only asks that you accept what happened. That's the law." Daniel felt his chest tighten. He had spent his life working the land, learning to handle the unpredictable weather, wild animals, and lonely nights. But nothing had prepared him for a situation like this. He had always believed that hard work and good intentions were enough to protect a person. Now he realized that some things were beyond logic, beyond effort. Some things demanded a choice he had never wanted to make. "I don't even know you," he said, his voice cracking slightly. I can't just agree to something like that. Not without knowing you. Not without understanding. Ayana's face softened a little. She understood. People outside her world often reacted this way. It was natural. But her eyes carried the weight of years of expectation and the seriousness of tradition. I know, she said gently, and I don't expect you to understand completely. But this is not a matter of wanting. It's a matter of law. And if the law is not honored, the consequences do not fall on me alone. Daniel looked down at the muddy ground. He could feel his boots sinking slightly into the soft soil. He thought of his life, his freedom, the quiet routine he had carefully built, and wondered if it could survive this unexpected responsibility. And yet, he could also see Ayana, brave, honest, caught in a position she never wanted. Somehow, the thought of leaving her to face judgment alone felt wrong. What happens if I refuse? He asked, his voice low. Ayana's expression darkened. Then I face punishment, not just from the tribe, but from my own family, my parents, my siblings. They would be ashamed. I could be forced into isolation. And someone else might be chosen. Someone who does not care about me or my wishes.
I am asking you to prevent that. You can stop that from happening.
Daniel exhaled slowly. It was not just a law he was facing. It was a human life in his hands. He had always believed in fairness, in helping others when he could. And now fairness demanded more than money, more than effort. It demanded courage and understanding. The rain had slowed, leaving the air damp and heavy. Daniel looked at Ayana again, noticing details he had not seen before. Her eyes were dark but not sad. They were steady, like she had faced hardship before. Her hair, damp and dark from the rain, framed a face that held strength and yet vulnerability. He realized she was not asking him to blindly follow tradition. She was asking him to protect her from harm that was real and serious. Can we talk about this somewhere safe? Daniel asked. Somewhere we can think, without fear of being watched or interrupted? Ayana hesitated, then nodded. There is a place nearby. My family will not come here immediately. We have some hours before anyone notices I am missing. But it is risky. The land is not neutral. It belongs to the tribe. I understand, Daniel said. We'll be careful. I won't do anything to put you in danger. Together they walked slowly through the rain-damp grass toward the nearby shelter she had mentioned. Along the way, Daniel asked questions: how the law had begun, why it existed, what it truly meant for those who were involved. Ayana answered cautiously, careful not to reveal details that might break rules or dishonor her community, but enough to make him understand the depth of the situation. The law is old, she explained. It comes from stories from generations who lived here long before anyone could remember. It was meant to protect people like me, and to make sure outsiders respect our space, but it also requires action. When lines are crossed, it is not meant to punish. It is meant to balance responsibility with honor. Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing every word. He realized that what he had first thought of as unfair or extreme was, in fact, deeply meaningful within a context he could barely understand. The more he listened, the more he saw that Ayana's concern was not for herself alone. It was for her family, her tribe, her future. As they reached the small clearing that served as her temporary safe space, Daniel noticed signs of careful planning, supplies, simple bedding, and a fire pit that could be used in emergencies. Ayana looked around and nodded. as if approving the safety of the space. "Now," she said softly, "we need to discuss what comes next. There are choices, even within the law, but they are limited. You have the right to speak and understand, but the law is clear on one point. You cannot walk away without consideration. You saw me, and that changed everything." Daniel took a deep breath. He thought of the ranch, of his solitary life, of the predictable rhythm he had relied on for so long. That world felt small and fragile compared to what he faced now. He realized that real life was never just work and routine. It was also moments like this, moments where responsibility, courage, and empathy intersected in ways a man could never prepare for. "I don't fully understand it yet," he said, "but I do understand you are asking for my help, and I cannot leave you alone to face consequences that are not your fault." Ayana's eyes softened slightly, and she gave a small nod. There was relief there, but it was not complete relief. Only the understanding that the first step had been taken. Daniel realized that this was only the beginning. The law had been invoked, and the future they faced was unknown, shaped by decisions they had yet to make. For the next several hours, they spoke cautiously, carefully navigating the fine line between conversation and confrontation. Daniel asked questions about the law, its history, and its meaning, while Ayana explained without breaking trust or tradition. She shared enough to help him understand the seriousness of what they faced, and he listened intently, absorbing every detail. By the time the sky began to clear and the sun peeked through clouds, both felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and focus. They were no longer strangers, but allies in a situation that neither had chosen. Daniel could feel the weight of responsibility on his shoulders, but also a strange sense of purpose. He had always lived a simple life, but this moment demanded more than simplicity. It demanded understanding, courage, and respect for someone else's world. As they prepared to leave the clearing, Daniel knew one thing for certain. Life had changed irrevocably. The law, the tradition, and the unexpected encounter had set a path neither could ignore. And even though fear and uncertainty still lingered, a quiet determination had begun to grow. They would face this together, step by step, and each would have to learn the meaning of honor, responsibility, and trust in ways neither had imagined. And in that rain-washed valley, at the edge of two worlds, the first true challenge of their intertwined lives had begun, one that would test courage, understanding, and the ability to see beyond fear to the choices that really mattered. The next morning, Daniel woke early as usual, but the quiet of his ranch felt heavier than ever. The events of the previous day lingered in his mind like a storm that refused to pass. He had always been a man of routines, someone who could face unpredictable weather, broken fences, and long, lonely nights with calm determination. Yet nothing in his life had prepared him for the weight of a law he barely understood, or for the unexpected responsibility of another person's honor resting on his shoulders. He walked slowly toward the barn, hands deep in his pockets, thinking. Every detail of his encounter with Ayana replayed in his mind. The way she had looked at him, the seriousness in her voice, and the unspoken pressure of a tradition that neither of them had chosen. His heart was heavy, but he knew he had to face the reality of what had happened. Ignoring it would not make it go away. Ayana had remained at the small clearing near the tribal land, safe for the night, but still under the shadow of her people's expectations. Daniel knew that she would be watched, even from afar, and that her family's concern would grow by the hour. It wasn't just about a law. It was about trust, respect, and the consequences of being seen when privacy mattered most. He had seen the fear in her eyes, the tension in her shoulders, and he understood that the pressure on her was far greater than anything he could imagine. As he fed the horses, Daniel considered his next steps. He could not ignore what had happened. Walking away might protect his comfort, his solitude, but it would abandon Ayanna to a fate she did not deserve. His mind wandered to her words from the previous evening. "You cannot walk away without consideration." Those words haunted him. They were not a threat, but a reminder. A reminder that life was sometimes about making decisions that were uncomfortable, confusing, and beyond personal desire. By mid-morning, Daniel decided to visit the clearing again. He needed to speak with Ayanna to understand more fully what she faced and to find a way forward. He saddled his horse and rode slowly, careful not to rush into a situation that could make her fear worse. As he approached the clearing, he saw her standing near the edge of the small shelter, her posture tense, but her gaze steady. "Ayanna!" he called softly, keeping his distance. "Are you all right?" She turned, relief flickering in her eyes. "I am," she said, her voice quiet. "But it is not easy." Daniel nodded. "I can see that. And I want to understand. I don't fully understand yet, but I want to help, if you will let me." She studied him carefully. "It is not simple. The law is not just about me. It is about my family, my community, and tradition. And it requires action. Action that affects both of us now." Daniel took a deep breath. "Then tell me everything I need to know. I cannot promise I will understand it all, but I will listen." For hours, Ayanna explained the law, its history, and its significance. She spoke of generations who had lived by it, of families who had followed it carefully to protect honor and respect. She described the consequences of ignoring it, not as a story, but as a reality that could impact her life and the lives of those she loved. Daniel listened, asking questions when necessary, trying to grasp the depth of what she was saying. The more he learned, the more he realized that this law was not punishment. It was responsibility. It was a framework that had been designed to ensure respect, fairness, and protection within the tribe. It demanded courage from those involved, especially from outsiders like him, who were suddenly placed in a role they never sought. Daniel felt conflicted. He had grown up valuing freedom, solitude, and personal choice. Yet here he faced a situation where his choices mattered not only to him, but to another person's safety, honor, and family. He thought of his own life, the quiet days on the ranch, the routines that had given him comfort. Everything he knew seemed small compared to the challenge before him. "We live in different worlds," he said at last, his voice low. "Your laws, your traditions, they are foreign to me, but I see now that they are real, and that they matter. I cannot ignore them. And I will not leave you to face this alone." Ayanna's face softened slightly. She could see sincerity in his eyes, a willingness to act with understanding rather than fear. "That is more than many would do," she said quietly. "Most outsiders would walk away, claiming they did not understand. But the law does not allow for ignorance to excuse action or inaction." The words struck Daniel deeply. He realized that being honorable was not about convenience. It was about facing what was difficult, making choices that were uncomfortable, and respecting the consequences of actions he did not intend. And in that moment, he understood something he had never considered before. Courage was not just about facing danger. Courage was about facing responsibility, even when it demanded everything you were not prepared to give. They spent the rest of the day discussing options within the law. Daniel learned that there were ways to approach the situation that respected both tradition and personal dignity. It was a delicate balance, requiring careful thought and patience. Each option had consequences, and each decision carried weight. But for the first time, Daniel began to see a path forward, one that did not ignore the law, one that did not abandon Ayana, and one that allowed him to act with integrity. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow across the valley, Daniel and Ayana sat together in quiet contemplation. The air was heavy with the memory of rain from the day before, and with the knowledge that their lives had already changed in ways neither could reverse. But in the silence, there was also understanding, a shared awareness that they faced this together, and that respect, patience, and courage would guide them through the uncertain days ahead. Daniel realized that he was learning something profound about human connection, responsibility, and empathy. He had always thought of his life in terms of work, land, and survival. Now, he understood that life's true challenges were often less about survival and more about moral courage, the courage to do what is right, even when it is difficult, confusing, and unfamiliar. Ayana, for her part, felt a small measure of relief. She had not expected to find understanding so quickly. Many had treated her situation with judgment or dismissal. Daniel, despite being an outsider, had listened. He had acknowledged the law, respected her position, and accepted responsibility, not blindly, but thoughtfully. It was a rare thing, and it offered hope that the days ahead could be navigated without dishonor or fear. As night fell, the first stars appearing above the valley, Daniel helped Ayana prepare a simple meal over the fire. They worked quietly, the silence now comfortable rather than tense. It was a small act, but it symbolized the growing trust between them, a trust rooted not in obligation, but in mutual respect and understanding. For Daniel, the day had been exhausting, both physically and emotionally. He returned to the edge of the clearing to check on the horses to ensure that everything was safe. He thought of the choices still ahead, the conversations yet to be had, and the decisions that would shape not only Ayana's life but his own. Yet, despite the uncertainty, he felt a quiet determination. He would face what was coming, guided by the principles he had always valued: fairness, responsibility, and respect for others. Ayana watched him from the firelight, noticing the lines of worry etched into his face. She understood the weight he carried. This was not an easy path for either of them, but she also recognized something important. He was willing to face the challenge, willing to learn, and willing to act with honor. And for her, that willingness meant more than words could ever convey. By the end of the evening, the tension between them had eased slightly, replaced by a sense of cautious partnership. They were still strangers in many ways, still navigating worlds that often seemed incompatible. But for the first time, they were not alone in facing the law. They had begun a journey together, one marked by responsibility, understanding, and the difficult but necessary work of bridging two very different worlds. As Daniel lay on his cot that night, staring at the rough wooden ceiling of the shelter, he realized that life had a way of testing a person in unexpected ways. He had faced storms on the ranch, wild animals, and long nights of isolation, but nothing had prepared him for this, a challenge that demanded empathy, courage, and a willingness to step into a world he barely understood. And yet, he felt a strange sense of readiness. The lessons of his life, the patience, the hard work, the quiet observation, had all led to this moment. He could face it, he knew, if he remained thoughtful, respectful, and courageous. And in the shadows of that small shelter, with the night wind whispering through the trees, Daniel and Ayana slept lightly, each aware of the path ahead. It would not be simple, it would not be easy. But for the first time, both could see that the law, tradition, and unexpected responsibility were not walls to separate them. They were bridges that, if crossed carefully, could lead to understanding, respect, and perhaps even a shared future. The valley was quiet, holding its breath, as the first true threads of trust and connection began to form between a rancher and a young tribal woman. Two people from very different worlds, now bound by circumstances neither had chosen, but both were learning to face together. The days that followed were a test of patience, understanding, and courage for both Daniel and Ayanna. Life, which had once been predictable for Daniel, now seemed unpredictable in every way. Each morning brought questions and decisions, and each evening left them reflecting on choices they had made together. The weight of the tribal law was never far from their thoughts, and neither could ignore the impact it had on their lives. Daniel had returned to his ranch to tend to his usual work, feeding the horses, mending fences, and repairing barns. But every task felt different now. He was no longer simply caring for the land. He was caring for a situation that involved another human being's honor and safety. His work was steady, methodical, but his mind wandered constantly to Ayanna and the law that had changed everything. He wondered how he could navigate this without making mistakes that could harm her or himself. Ayanna, meanwhile, remained cautious but cooperative. She had learned to move carefully, to consider each action in terms of its consequences. She was not used to relying on outsiders, and yet Daniel's presence brought a sense of calm she had not expected. It was not comfort in the ordinary sense, but a quiet reassurance that someone outside her world could act with understanding, respect, and patience. That realization allowed her to focus, to think clearly about the difficult choices ahead. One afternoon they sat together near the clearing, talking quietly about what might come next. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. Daniel could see the determination in Ayanna's eyes, the same determination he had noticed on their first day. She was strong, but there was also vulnerability, a recognition that the world could be harsh and unforgiving if rules and tradition were ignored. "I've been thinking," Daniel said carefully, "about what you told me, about the law, about how it protects people and families. I see now that it's not about control. It's about responsibility. And responsibility isn't easy." Ayanna nodded, her hands folded in her lap. "It is not meant to be easy. It is meant to guide us, to remind us that our actions matter. It is not punishment. It is protection." "Hello," Daniel exhaled slowly. "I never thought of it that way. I thought of rules as something strict, something to follow without understanding. But now I see that this law, it's about fairness, respect, and care. It's about making sure that people are safe, even if the situation is complicated." Ayanna looked at him, her expression softening. It is rare for someone outside the tribe to understand that. Most people see only the surface. But you
are trying, and that counts for something.
They sat in silence for a while, watching the wind bend the tall grass and listening to birds calling in the distance. The quiet gave them both a chance to think, to reflect on what had happened and what would happen next. Daniel realized that the law, the expectations, and the pressure were not simply challenges. They were lessons about respect, courage, and the ways that one person's choices can affect another's life. As the day went on, Daniel and Ayanna faced a practical challenge. Ayanna needed to return to her family's area to gather essential supplies, but doing so required careful planning. The tribal land was watched, and any misstep could cause serious trouble. Daniel insisted on accompanying her, both to help and to ensure safety. The journey was quiet, tense, and filled with unspoken questions. Every shadow seemed larger, every sound sharper, as they moved carefully through the trees. When they arrived at the small area where Ayanna kept her supplies, Daniel helped her gather what was needed. She moved with precision, taking only what was necessary, and carefully returning everything to its original place afterward. Daniel observed her closely, noticing her awareness and thoughtfulness. It struck him that this carefulness was a skill born not from fear, but from respect. Respect for the law, for her family, and for the traditions that shaped her life. As they prepared to leave, Ayanna spoke quietly. "You are learning quickly," she said. "Most outsiders would panic or try to act without thinking. But you consider the consequences. That is important." Daniel smiled faintly. "I'm learning from you. You are teaching me more than I could have imagined. Not just about the law, but about life itself. About responsibility, respect, and courage." They moved back through the trees together, careful to stay within paths that would not draw attention. Daniel felt a growing sense of connection with Ayanna, not just as someone he was responsible for, but as a person with her own strength, intelligence, and perspective. He realized that their relationship was no longer defined solely by the law. It was defined by trust, understanding, and a shared recognition of the challenges they faced. That evening, as they returned to the clearing, a small crisis arose. One of the horses Daniel had brought with him became frightened, struggling against the tether. Daniel moved quickly, calming the animal and securing it safely. Ayanna watched, impressed by his calm and methodical approach. "You handle pressure well," she said quietly. "I can see why you manage a ranch alone. You are steady, even when things are difficult." Daniel chuckled softly. "I have had practice, but today I realize that this is different from anything I have faced before. The stakes are higher, the consequences are real." Ayanna nodded, understanding his meaning. "Yes, and that is why careful thought is necessary. Every action has an effect. Every decision matters." For the rest of the evening they spoke about the future, not in terms of promises or decisions yet, but in terms of possibilities. They discussed how they could move forward while respecting the law, protecting Ayanna, and allowing Daniel to act with integrity. It was a delicate balance, but the conversation itself created a sense of clarity. Both could see the challenges ahead more clearly, and both felt a quiet determination to face them together. As night fell, they sat by the fire, sharing a simple meal. The flames flickered, casting dancing shadows across the clearing. Daniel thought about the events of the past days, the sudden encounter, the explanation of the law, the careful discussions, and the quiet moments of trust that had begun to form. He realized that life had changed irrevocably, and that the choices they made now would shape the days, months, and perhaps years to come. Ayanna felt a similar realization. She had expected fear, confusion, and isolation. Instead, she found understanding, patience, and a willingness to act responsibly. Daniel was not just an outsider caught in her world. He was a partner in facing the challenges the law had presented. And in that partnership, she found a sense of hope. By the time they settled for the night, both were tired but thoughtful. Daniel lay on his cot, staring at the stars above the trees. He thought about courage, responsibility, and the ways that one person's actions could affect another's life. He understood that this was not a story with a simple ending. It was a journey of learning, compromise, and growth. Ayanna, meanwhile, lay on her mat nearby, reflecting on her own feelings. She had feared judgment, punishment, and misunderstanding. Yet now she saw the possibility of trust, guidance, and careful cooperation. Daniel's presence had changed the situation, not by bending tradition, but by respecting it. She felt a growing sense of confidence that they could face the challenges ahead together. The next morning, they woke to another day of work and preparation. Daniel checked the horses and equipment, while Ayanna gathered information about the next steps they could take to navigate the law safely. Each action was deliberate, each decision considered carefully. They both understood that mistakes could have serious consequences, but they also understood that fear should not prevent action. Throughout the day, they moved with purpose and caution, learning from each other and from the situation itself. Daniel learned patience and attention to detail, while Ayanna learned that outsiders could act with respect and integrity. They began to see their partnership not as forced by circumstance, but as something valuable in its own right. As evening approached, Daniel and Ayanna reflected on the day. They had managed challenges, avoided potential problems, and taken careful steps toward understanding the law and each other. They realized that while their path was uncertain, they were learning to navigate it together. And in that quiet valley, under the light of the setting sun, they felt a small but significant shift. What had begun as fear and confusion was now becoming understanding, trust, and a sense of shared purpose. The law was still a challenge, the tradition still a weight, but together they had begun to see a way forward, one step at a time, carefully, thoughtfully, and with respect for both the past and the possibilities of the future. The days passed, and Daniel and Ayanna found themselves growing into a rhythm of shared responsibility. The law, once a looming shadow over their lives, became a guide for their actions. Each choice they made was deliberate, thoughtful, and measured. They still faced challenges, but the fear that had gripped them in the beginning was slowly replaced by understanding and trust. Daniel had returned to his ranch for part of each day, tending to his work with the same careful precision he always had. But now, every task felt different. He repaired fences, fed the animals, and checked the water troughs with more than routine care. He worked with a new awareness that his actions, however small, could impact more than just the land. He carried responsibility for another person's safety and honor, and it weighed on him, not as a burden, but as a call to act with integrity. Ayanna, meanwhile, remained cautious but steadily confident. She moved with awareness, prepared for any unexpected challenges. Yet she began to trust Daniel's judgment more each day. She saw that he approached every situation thoughtfully, respecting the traditions that had shaped her life, and that he would not act recklessly or without understanding. That trust grew quietly, like the first signs of spring after a long winter, and with it came relief. One morning, Daniel suggested they visit the tribal elders together. It was a step that required courage and careful thought, for it meant facing the people whose law had first created the tension in their lives. Ayanna agreed, and together they walked through the familiar paths to the edge of the tribal land. The air was crisp and still, the early sunlight casting long shadows across the grass. As they approached, Daniel felt a mix of apprehension and determination. He had spent days learning about the law, about Ayanna's family, and about the responsibilities he now carried. He knew he could not act as an outsider simply demanding understanding. He needed to listen, to respect, and to demonstrate the sincerity of his intentions. Ayanna led the way, moving with quiet confidence. The elders watched them approach, their faces serious but not unkind. Daniel greeted them with a bow of respect, his voice steady as he introduced himself. "I am Daniel Carter," he said. "I am here because I understand that a responsibility has been placed before me. I am here to act with respect for your law and for Ayanna's honor." The eldest among them, a woman whose eyes held the wisdom of generations, studied him carefully. She asked questions, not to challenge him, but to understand his intentions and character. Daniel answered honestly, explaining his perspective, his confusion, and the steps he had taken to act responsibly. He spoke of his willingness to learn, to follow the law, and to protect Ayana from harm. Ayana watched quietly, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. She felt a mix of pride and relief. Daniel's words were not perfect, and his understanding was still growing, but they were sincere. They showed thought, care, and courage, the very qualities the law required of anyone who found themselves in this position. The elders nodded slowly. "You have listened?" the eldest woman said. "You have acted with care and respect. You have not sought to avoid responsibility, nor have you acted without thought. These are the signs of someone who honors both the law and the people it protects." Daniel felt a wave of relief. The approval of the elders did not mean that everything would be easy, but it meant that he had acted correctly. More importantly, it meant that Ayana was safe from misunderstanding, from judgment, and from consequences she had feared. Over the next several days, they worked together to prepare for the formal acknowledgement of the law's requirements. Daniel learned more about the tribe's customs, attending conversations with the elders, and observing the careful rituals and practices that had been followed for generations. Ayana guided him through each step, explaining the meaning behind every action, every word, and every gesture. Daniel listened, absorbed, and respected every detail. During this time, the bond between Daniel and Ayana grew stronger. It was not a bond of romance at first, though there were moments of quiet understanding and shared laughter. It was a bond of trust, respect, and shared purpose. They had been thrown together by circumstances beyond their control, but through patience, communication, and courage, they were finding common ground. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the distant hills, Daniel and Ayana walked along the ridge overlooking the valley. The sky was painted with shades of orange, pink, and purple, reflecting the calm after weeks of tension and uncertainty.
"I never imagined life could be like this,"
Daniel said quietly. "I thought I knew responsibility, work, and solitude. But this is different. I understand now that responsibility is more than caring for yourself or your land. It is about protecting others, even when it is uncomfortable." Ayana smiled faintly. "You have learned quickly. Most outsiders do not take the time to understand. They act or they ignore, and the consequences fall on those like me. You have chosen differently." Daniel looked at her, feeling the weight and meaning of her words. He realized that their journey together had changed him. He was no longer just a solitary rancher. He was someone who had stepped into a world beyond his own, someone who had faced responsibility with care and courage. The days continued, and the formal acknowledgement of the law approached. Daniel and Ayana prepared carefully, ensuring that all traditions were respected and that every step honored the expectations of the tribe. When the day finally arrived, the elders led the ceremony with dignity and precision. Daniel followed each instruction, speaking with sincerity and demonstrating respect. Ayana's presence beside him was steady and calm, a testament to the trust they had built. The ceremony concluded with the acknowledgement that Daniel had accepted responsibility in accordance with the law. The elders offered their blessing, not only for the fulfillment of tradition, but for the wisdom, patience, and courage Daniel had shown. Ayana's family nodded with relief, knowing she was safe and respected. Afterward, Daniel and Ayana walked alone for a while, letting the quiet valley surround them. The tension that had marked their first days together had softened, replaced by understanding, respect, and a shared recognition of the journey they had undertaken. "You did well," Ayana said softly. "Not just because you followed the law, but because you understood its meaning. You acted with integrity." Daniel smiled faintly. "I learned from you. You taught me about responsibility, courage, and respect. I cannot imagine facing this without your guidance." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their experiences settling around them. Daniel realized that life would never be the same, and neither would Ayana's, but for the first time, that realization did not bring fear. It brought a sense of accomplishment, growth, and hope. In the weeks that followed, Daniel returned to his ranch with a new perspective. The work remained, the land still required care, but his understanding of life had deepened. He knew that responsibility was not just about what one did alone, but about the connections and obligations shared with others. And he knew that courage was not about strength or skill alone. It was about integrity, respect, and willingness to act for the right reasons. Ayana continued to live with her family, but her bond with Daniel remained strong. They met carefully and thoughtfully, navigating both tradition and personal connection. They laughed together, shared stories, and supported each other. The law that had first brought tension and fear had become a bridge, connecting two very different lives through understanding and respect. One evening, as the sun set over the valley, Daniel and Ayana stood together watching the sky. They reflected on the journey they had shared, from fear and confusion to understanding and trust. They knew that challenges would continue, as life always did, but they also knew that they had learned the meaning of responsibility, courage, and respect in ways that would guide them forever. "This valley has changed us," Daniel said quietly, "not because it is dangerous or difficult, but because it has taught us to act with care, to listen, and to understand. I will never forget these lessons." Ayana nodded, smiling. "And I will never forget that someone outside my world could act with honesty, patience, and courage. You have honored not just me, but everything that this law represents." The sun dipped below the hills, leaving the valley bathed in the soft glow of evening. For Daniel and Ayana, the story of fear, responsibility, and trust had reached a turning point. They had faced the unexpected, navigated tradition, and discovered that courage and understanding could bridge worlds. And in that quiet valley where land and law met, two lives were forever changed, not by obligation alone, but by the choices they made, the respect they shared, and the courage they found in each other. The journey had been difficult, the path uncertain, but the ending was not just about law or tradition. It was about growth, trust, and the quiet strength that comes from facing life together. In the days that followed, the rancher and the young woman moved forward with purpose and thoughtfulness. The law had been honored, Ayana's safety ensured, and Daniel had gained wisdom far beyond what he had known before. Their lives were still separate in many ways, but the bond forged through trust, responsibility, and courage remained. And that bond, strong and steady, would guide them for all the days to come. The story of that valley, the unexpected encounter, and the weight of a law older than memory had come to a close. But its lessons lived on in both of them, shaping their choices, their understanding, and their respect for life, tradition, and the people who cross our paths when we least expect it.